Intro to Old Testament, Unit 11, Period of the Judges. The key ideas in the book of Judges are the cycles of the Judges period, God's justice and His grace, His sovereign provision of deliverance, and the covenant failure by the people, the priests, and the tribal leadership. The purpose of Judges is to show the failure of the Israelites to keep their part of the covenant. The cycles show how God demonstrated His power and mercy by delivering them time after time. The book shows that neither the leadership of the judges nor the tribal leadership succeeded in helping the people remain faithful. Instead, the leaders were as bad as the people. When we think about the historical background of the judges, this is going to come after the conquest in the book of Joshua and before a kingship is devised in 1 Samuel. There was lucrative trade routes and seaports at Syro-Palestine. There were many great powers at this time: the Egyptians, the Hittites, the Mitannian Empire, the Assyrians. Even Ramses the Great ruled during this period. As we're talking about the 13th and the 12th century, or even as early as the 14th century BC, and these great powers had little influence in the book of Judges. Message really tells us what happened religiously between the person Joshua and David. Now, when we take a look at the book of Judges, we have a fourfold cycle. And this fourfold cycle is the people sinning, and then the oppression of the people, and the people repenting, and then God sending a deliverer that we normally call a judge. Now, this deliverer was a charismatic leader, and his main function is just to free the people from the oppression under which they are suffering. Now, in the opening of the book of Judges, we read, after the death of Joshua, the Israelites asked the Lord, "Who will be the first to go up and fight for us against the Canaanites?" Now remember that Joshua led the people in the conquest of the land, but here we are introduced to territory that had not been secured for them. The Lord answered, "Judah is to go. I have given the land into their hands." So they then go against the Canaanites and the Perizzites, and it said they struck down 10,000 men of Besek. It was there that they found Adoni-Bezek and fought against him, putting to rout the Canaanites and Perizzites. The Adoni-Bezek claims that he had cut off the thumbs and the big toes of the kings that he had conquered. 70 kings had been treated this way. Now Adoni-Bezek suffers the same fate. This makes it impossible for them to hold a sword or to have balance so that they can fight in battles. So this is the reason that that is done. Now we also read in the first chapter, in verse 16, the descendants of Moses' father-in-law, the Kenite, went up from the city of palms with the men of Judah to live among the people of the desert of Judah in the Negev near Arad. So we're introduced to the father-in-law of Moses once again. We also have a visit from an angel of the Lord who is speaking to the people. In chapter 2, it says, "The angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I brought you up out of Egypt and led you into the land that I swore to give to your forefathers. I said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall not make a covenant with the people of this land." Now he is informing them that they have failed to keep their part of the bargain. In verse 4, when the angel of the Lord had spoken these things to all the Israelites, the people wept aloud, and they called that place Bochim. That means weeping. And there they offered sacrifices to the Lord. And then we read about the disobedience of the people. In verse 6, Joshua had dismissed the Israelites. They went to take possession of the land, each to his own inheritance. The people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who had seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel. And that's what we are told too at the end of the book of Joshua. But then it says in verse 10, after that whole generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation grew up and knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. Remember at the end of the book of Joshua where the people promised that they were going to follow Yahweh, and Joshua said, you're not able to do this. And they came back, oh yes we are. Well, here they don't do it. After a period of time, they begin to fall into the habits of the people in the land that they were supposed to drive out. It says that they followed and worshiped various gods of the peoples around them. They provoked the Lord to anger because they forsook him and served Baals and the Ashtoreths. In his anger against Israel, the Lord handed them over to raiders who plundered them. He sold them to their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. And then whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. They were in great distress. And we are also told the number of nations that were still in the land. In chapter 3, verse 1, these are the nations the Lord left to test all these Israelites who had not experienced any of the wars in Canaan. He did this only to teach warfare to the descendants of the Israelites who had not had previous battle experience. You had the 5 rulers of the Philistines, the Canaanites, the Sidonians, the Hivites living in the Lebanon mountains from Mount Baal Hermon to Lebo Hamath, and these were left to test the Israelites. It says in verse 5, the Israelites lived among the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Now these were the people that they were supposed to drive out of the land of Canaan. They took their daughters in marriage and gave their own daughters to their sons and served their gods. So you see that things have turned out very badly for the Israelites. And then we have a number of judges who are mentioned. And the first of these is one that we have seen before, and that is Othniel. And it says, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, so that he sold them into the hands of Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Aram Naharaim, to whom the Israelites were subject for 8 years. When they cried out to the Lord, he raised up for them a deliverer, Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, who saved them. Now, we're not told just where this took place, but we're told that Othniel was the one who was the first of these judges. And then again in chapter 3, verse 12, we read about the Israelites being under the control of the Moabites. They had come across the river, and their king was living in Jericho, and he oppressed them for 18 years. Then God raised up for them a deliverer, and this was a left-handed man by the name of Ehud. Ehud made a sword, a double-edged sword, about 18 inches long, and he put that on the right side where it would not be observed. And then it says that Ehud was responsible for taking tribute to the king of Moab. And this he did. In verse 18, after Ehud had presented the tribute, he sent on their way the men who had carried it. At the idols near Gilgal, he himself turned back and said, I have a secret message for you, O king. Since it was a secret message, the king sent away everyone but Ehud. And then Ehud took his sword from his right thigh, and he ran it into the belly of Eglon. It came out the rear. He didn't bother to pull it out. It says that the fat closed in on top of the sword. And then Ehud closed the doors, locked them, and went away. The retainers of Eglon came looking for him, and the door was locked, and so they thought maybe he was relieving himself, and so they didn't bother to open the door. But after a while, they finally opened it and found that he was dead. Meanwhile, Ehud summoned the tribal people. In verse 27, when he arrived there at Serah, he blew the trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites went down with him from the hills, with him leading them. They attacked the Moabites. They also took the fords of the Jordan River. And when any Moabite came along, they killed them. In verse 29, it says that at that time they struck down about 10,000 Moabites, all vigorous and strong. Not a man escaped. And that day Moab was made subject to Israel, and the land had peace for 80 years. And this often is the case, that it mentions how long the land is at rest before there is a foreign power that comes in and controls them. And then there's this Shamgar in chapter 3, verse 31. After Ehud came Shamgar, son of Anat. Now, he probably is a Hurrian from his name, rather than an Israelite, but he somehow is connected with the Israelites. And he's called the son of Anat. Anat is the goddess of war, and this may be given to him because of his deeds, rather than her being his mother. He struck down 600 Philistines with an ox goad. He too saved Israel. Now that's all we're told about Shamgar. An ox goad, by the way, is a pole that has a point on it that is used to prod oxen. After Ehud, the Israelites once again did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and he sold them into the hands of Jabin, king of Canaan, who lived in Hatzor. The commander of his army was Sisera. And this is a case where we are introduced to a prophetess, Deborah. We are told that she judged Israel. She sent for Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kadesh in Naphtali, and says to him to get 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun and go to Mount Tabor. Now, Barak doesn't want to do this unless Deborah goes along with him. So she says she will. But she also predicts at that time that he's not going to get the honor, but the honor is going to go to a woman. So the battle takes place in the Kidron Valley. And we have it mentioned here that the chariots of Sisera come into the Kidron Valley, and there they are bogged down because of the mud. The Kidron Valley is drained by a river, the Kishon River. And when there is a heavy rain, it doesn't drain quickly enough, and so you have a lot of bog. And this is what caused the wheels of the chariots to be difficult to move. The forces of Barak, lightly armed soldiers, came down and they killed the army of Sisera. Sisera got down from his own chariot and fled on foot. He came to the tent of Jael, or Yael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. Now, we were told about the Kenites that moved from where they had previously been and moved into this area. And there was friendly relations between Jabin, king of Hatzor, and the clan of Heber the Kenite. Yael went out to meet Sisera and invited him in. He is tired from his running. He says that he's thirsty. He wants some water. So she opened a skin of milk, gave him a drink, and covered him up. Now, milk has a tendency to make a person sleepy. And so he went to sleep immediately. And then she took a tent peg and a hammer and drove it through the temple of Sisera and killed him. Now, in this case, we have both the account that is given to us in chapter 4, which is a prose account, and then we have a poetic account given to us in chapter 5. And if you put the two of these together, you have a good idea of what really happened. In chapter 5, verse 19, kings came, they fought. The kings of Canaan fought at Taanach by the waters of Megiddo, but they carried off no silver, no plunder. From the heavens the stars fought. From their courses they fought against Sisera. The river Kishon swept them away, the age-old river, the river Kishon. March on, my soul, be strong. And so by paying attention to the Kishon River, we have the idea that the army of Sisera was not able to maneuver properly and were overcome by the Israelites. At the end of the poetic section in verse 28, it says, "Through the window peered Sisera's mother. Behind the lattice she cried out, 'Why is his chariot so long in coming? Why is the clatter of his chariots delayed?' The wisest of her ladies answer her, 'Indeed, she keeps saying to herself, Are they not finding and dividing the spoils? But that's not what was happening. They were destroyed. So we have both chapter 4 and chapter 5 tell us of the defeat of the army of Jabin, who is in Hatzor. The land had peace 40 years. Now these may be just round numbers, and it is hard to know exactly what the chronology is, because some of these events may have overlapped. One may have taken place in the southern part of the country, another one in the northern part, and they aren't international in scope. They are national. In chapter 6, we are introduced to Gideon. He is a famous character. It says that the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years he gave them into the hands of the Midianites. Notice the cycle again. They sin, so God turns them over to a foreign power. The oppression of the Midianites was very difficult for them. As it says, the eastern peoples invaded the country. They camped on the land and ruined the crops all the way to Gaza, and did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither sheep, nor cattle, nor donkeys. They came up with their livestock and their tents like swarms of locusts. So there are a huge number of them. And then it says in verse 7, the Israelites cried to the Lord because of the Midians. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says: I brought you up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. I snatched you from the power of Egypt and from the hand of all your oppressors. I drove them from before you and gave you their land. I said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not worship the gods of the Amorites in whose land you live. But you have not listened to me. And then the angel visits Gideon, and we're told that he mentions, the Lord is with you, mighty warrior. Gideon immediately challenges this and asks, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our fathers told us about when they said, did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and put us into the hand of Midian. Now that's true. That's what he's done. It's this cycle again, this fourfold cycle. The Lord told Gideon, go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you? Well, Gideon says that he is not very important. His family is one of the least in Israel. And how can he accomplish this? And so Gideon then offers a sacrifice to the angel. He prepared a young goat, and from an ephah of flour he made bread without yeast. He placed them on a rock. And then the angel touched the tip of the staff that was in his hand, and the meat and the unleavened bread were burned up by fire, and the angel ascended in the fire. Gideon is told, peace, do not be afraid, you are not going to die. So Gideon built an altar to the Lord and called it, the Lord is peace. And that same night, he takes the second bull of his father and destroys the altar of Baal and builds a new altar, and on that altar he sacrifices the bull. Now he's afraid to do this in the open, so he does it at night. And you remember that Gideon says that I'm not very important. He has 10 of his servants that help him destroy the altar of Baal. And then in verse 28, in the morning, when the men of the town got up, there was Baal's altar demolished, with the Asherah pole beside it cut down, and the second bull sacrificed on the newly built altar. And when they investigated, they found out that Gideon had done this, and they named him Jerubbaal, that is, let Baal contend. And then Gideon is supposed to lead an army, but he needs more assurance. In verse 33 of chapter 6, all the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples joined forces and crossed over the Jordan and camped in the valley of Jezreel. Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon. He blew a trumpet, summoning the Abiezrites to follow him. And he sent messengers throughout Manasseh, calling them to arms, and also into Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali. Now he ends up with an army of 32,000. But that's going to be too many. Well, in the meantime, Gideon wants some evidence from the Lord. And he says, I'm going to place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. And if that fleece is wet and the ground around it is dry, I'll know that you mean this. And that's what happened. But then Gideon says, I need a reverse miracle. This time the fleece dry and all the land around it wet. And God did that. And then we have them camped at the spring of Harod. And the Lord said to Gideon in chapter 7, verse 2, you have too many men for me to deliver Midian into their hands. So all of those who were fearful or that wanted to, they could leave. And so it says that 22,000 men left. And God says there are still too many. So he is to take them to the water, and God will choose the ones he wants. There were 300 men who lapped the water with their tongues like a dog, and the others knelt down to drink. It says 300 men lapped with their hands to their mouths. All the rest got down on their knees to drink. It is these 300 soldiers that are now picked as Gideon's army. He divides them into 3 parts. They take the trumpets and the jars and the torches from the rest of the Israelites, and they are ready now to engage the enemy. But Gideon has one more thing that's told him. If you're still fearful, go to the camp of the enemy and listen to what is said. And so this is what he did. In verse 13, Gideon arrived just as a man was telling a friend his dream. I had a dream, he was saying. A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed. His friend responded, this can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands. So this is the clincher for Gideon. He hears this, and then he leads his 3 companies of soldiers. They divide around the camp, and it says in verse 22, when the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn on each other with their swords. The army fled to Beth Shittah toward Zarephath as far as the border of Abel Meholah near Tabah. So the enemy actually fights among themselves, and many of them kill each other. And then they are pursued by Gideon. The men of Ephraim are called out in verse 25, and at the waters of the Jordan, as far as Beth Barah, they captured two of the Midianite leaders, Oreb and Zeb. They killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb and Zeb at the winepress of Zeb. They pursued the Midianites and brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon, who was by the Jordan. Now the men of Ephraim wanted to know why Gideon didn't call them at first. And Gideon pacifies them here and says, look what you've done. You've got two of the leaders of the Midianites. And so they were then calmed. What they would like, you see, is to be able to get plunder when they defeat the enemy. So Gideon pursues the Midianites across the Jordan into Transjordan, and he tries to get help from some of the Israelite communities there. They went to the men of Sukkot and asked for some bread. And the officials of Sukkot said, do you already have the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna in your possession? Why should we give bread to your troops? So they refused to help them. And then they go on to Peniel, and they don't help him either. So he promises when he comes back, he's going to punish them. He continues on in verse 11, Gideon went up by the route of the nomads east of Nobah and Jogbehah, and fell upon the unsuspecting army. Zebah and Zalmunna, the two kings of Midian, fled, but he pursued them and captured them, routing their entire army. And then he came back and he stopped at Sukkot, and he found a young man. He wrote down the names of the 77 officials of Sukkot, the elders. And when Gideon then came, he took these 77 elders and he taught the men of Sukkot a lesson by punishing them with desert thorns and briars. He also pulled down the tower of Peniel and killed the men of the town. And then Gideon wants to know what kind of men these leaders of the Midianites killed at Tabor. And when they were described, Gideon realizes they were his brothers. And then he wants Jether, his oldest son, to kill these two kings, but he doesn't want to do that. And so Gideon himself stepped forward. He killed them, took the ornaments off their camels' necks. Notice that the animals themselves are wearing emblems. Now we're told of what Gideon did, and it is bad. Israelites said to Gideon, rule over us, you, your son, and your grandson. But he refuses to do this. And what he does want, though, is the gold from the earrings of their plunder that they had taken from the Midianites. And he also had what he had taken off the camels' necks. And Gideon made the gold into an ephod, which he placed in Ophrah, his town. All Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping it there. And it became a snare to Gideon and his family. So he sins after God has given him this great victory. And then we are told that the land enjoyed peace 40 years. And Gideon had 70 sons of his own, for he had many wives. His concubine, who lived in Shechem, also bore him a son, whom he named Abimelech. And then Gideon died and was buried in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. And then it says that the people prostrated themselves to the Baals. They set up Baal-berith as their god, and they did not remember the Lord their God, who had rescued them from the hands of all their enemies on every side. They also failed to show gratitude to the family of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, for all the good things he had done for them. The one son that is in Shechem makes a pact with the people of Shechem. They provide him money so that he can hire some scoundrels. And he then goes and kills all 70 half-brothers that were living in the town of Gideon. The only one that escaped is the youngest son. And he went up to the top of Mount Gerizim, and he tells a parable. He said, "Listen to me, citizens of Shechem, so that God may listen to you. One day the trees went out to anoint a king for themselves. And he said to the olive tree, 'Be our king.' He refuses. Then they say to the fig tree, 'Come, be our king.' But he refused. Then they said to the vine, 'Come and be our king.' He also refuses." And says that they then turn to the thorn bush, and he says that if you really want to anoint me king over you, come and take refuge in my shade. But if not, then let fire come out of the thorn bush and consume the cedars of Lebanon. Now, of course, you know that this would not be done. You wouldn't use a thorn bush. But this is what the youngest son had said, Jotham, and this is what actually happened later. Abimelech begins to rule in Shechem, and then he has trouble with the Shechemites, and so he leaves the city, and Gaal, son of Ebed, moved with his brothers into Shechem, and he talks big. He says that he could be the leader of the Shechemites. But then you have a civil war that takes place. The army of Abimelech comes and fights against Gaal and the men that he has in Shechem, and the city is destroyed. In verse 50, we are told that Abimelech went to Thebez and besieged it and captured it. Inside the city, however, was a strong tower to which all the men and women, all the people of the city, fled. They locked themselves in and climbed up on the tower roof. Abimelech went to the tower and stormed it, but as he approached the entrance to the tower to set it on fire, a woman dropped an upper millstone on his head and cracked his skull. Hurriedly he called to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and kill me, so that they can't say a woman killed him." So his servant ran him through, and he died. And when the Israelites saw that Abimelech was dead, they went home. So it says, God repaid the wickedness that Abimelech had done to his father by murdering his 70 brothers. In chapter 10, we are introduced to individuals who are mentioned as judges, but we do not have a story about them. There is Tola, son of Puah, the son of Dodo, and he lived in Shamir in the hill country of Ephraim. He led Israel 23 years. Then he died and was buried in Shamir. In verse 3, he was followed by Yair of Gilead, who led Israel 22 years. He had 30 sons who rode 30 donkeys. They controlled 30 towns in Gilead, which to this day are called Havot Yair. When Yair died, he was buried in Kamon.